Hi, I'm John, one of the High Rock pastors. Have you ever heard someone say something so strange, so ridiculous, that you couldn't believe what you just heard? And yet, that person was so confident in what they said that for just a minute, you wondered if they might be right. As we continue our series, Blessed, we're continuing through the opening of Jesus' most famous sermon, his Sermon on the Mount. And each week, Jesus makes yet another pronouncement that seems so ridiculous that you think it must be a joke. But Jesus is absolutely serious. Blessed are the poor in spirit, those folks who are spiritually empty, those who know they have nothing to offer to God. They are blessed. Blessed are those who mourn, those people who weep over the brokenness of the world, those who are wrecked by the awareness of their own sin. Blessed, says Jesus. And this week, blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Really, Jesus? The meek? For the people who were sitting on that mountain listening to Jesus, I'm sure that was hard to believe. It's hard for us to believe right now. The meek shall inherit the earth? I mean, look around you. Look at the news. The people who own everything, are they the meek? Or are they the proud and the mighty? Look at politics. Do people win arguments and rise to office by being meek? Or are we more likely to reward arrogant bullies and conniving manipulators? Look at sports. Do we celebrate quiet humility and gentleness? Or do we celebrate those who raise intimidation and trash talking to an art form? Look at business. Do the spoils go to the meek, or do the meek get preyed upon? And in the world of celebrity, are the winners people who demonstrate gentle respect, or are the winners shameless self-promoters? So what is Jesus talking about when he says, blessed are the meek? And if they're supposed to inherit the earth, why don't we see the meek in charge right now? I want to confess something to you right now. I'm afraid that many of us will leave here today unchanged, unchallenged. We'll hear Jesus' words and think, that's a nice sentiment, but the world doesn't work that way. Maybe in the future when Jesus returns and sets things right. And so we'll hear Jesus' words as if there's some kind of idealistic encouragement, something to give the meek hope for the future, even while the world crushes them into the dust right now. And we'll leave here, inspired by Jesus' idealism, but unchanged, still operating under the principle that you have to make your own way, that you have to look out for number one, that there is no promotion without self-promotion. But Jesus isn't interested in inspiring you. He wants to transform you. And he isn't here to tell you how the world works. You already know that. He's here to tell you how his kingdom works. And his kingdom is coming. It's already started. I want to show you how these statements, these beatitudes, blessed are the poor in spirit, blessed are those who mourn, blessed are the meek, and all the rest. I want to show you how these fit into God's kingdom that Jesus is announcing to us. But first, I want to give you something to think about. Because I know that no matter how compelling Jesus is, no matter how convincing I might be today, many of you will be tempted to walk away and still put Jesus' words into a box that says, nice idea, but the world just doesn't work that way. So before you file away blessed are the meek into your suggestion box, I want to give you some questions to provoke some thought. Okay, so how many of you here know how to ride a bike? Go ahead, just raise your hand for everyone to see. Okay, you can put your hands down. And how many of you not only know how to ride a bike, you actually ride pretty regularly? Go ahead, raise your hand. Okay, next question. How many of you here know how to ride a motorcycle? And for those of you who know how to ride a motorcycle, how many of you have taken the Motorcycle Safety Foundation test? Go ahead, raise your hand. Okay, what I want you to do now is put your hands forward like you're holding on to the handlebars of your bike right now. Doesn't matter if it's a bicycle or a motorcycle, but it has to be a two-wheeler, no three-wheelers. Okay, so your hands are on the handlebars. You're riding along maybe 20 miles per hour, and suddenly there's a dangerous obstacle on your right. Maybe a car cuts you off. Maybe you're in the bike lane and suddenly someone opens a door. That's my biggest fear when cycling. And to avoid disaster, you have to make a sudden and sharp left turn. So now, with your hands on the handlebars, make your sudden left turn. Go ahead, do it again, just so you're clear. Okay, so making that left turn, how many of you turned to the left by pushing with your right hand or pulling with your left? Maybe both. Go ahead and raise your hand if you just cranked that wheel to the left. Okay. And how many of you, faced with imminent disaster, made your sharp left turn by turning to the right before going left? In other words, to turn left, you started by pushing with your left and pulling with your right. Go ahead and raise your hands if you did that. All right. Some of you made it to safety, and some of you crashed and burned. The people who turned left by pushing with their left survived. In other words, the people who turned left by first turning right were right. This is a principle called countersteering. And if you've taken the Motorcycle Safety Foundation course, they taught you this. Some states include countersteering on the motorcycle driver's license test. And with bikes, when you watch someone learn to ride, you'll see them do a whole lot of this, jacking the wheel back and forth, constantly correcting and overcorrecting. What's going on there? What's happening is that your brain thinks that to go left, you have to turn the handlebars to the left. But when you do that, the wheel starts to slip out from underneath you, forcing your bike to immediately lean to the right. And in order not to fall, you have to then lean to the right and turn the wheel to the right in order to keep your balance. So when you want to avoid getting doored while riding in the bike lane, you have to very quickly turn slightly right, which is toward danger, in order to create the bike lean to the left so that you can then turn left and avoid the door. So you push left to lean left in order to turn left. Now, telling you this, some of you don't believe me. You think that it sounds interesting, but your brain still says, if I want to turn to the left, I should push with my right immediately on my handlebars so that I can go to the left. But I assure you, I am not making this up. Wilbur Wright, the one who helped invent the airplane, saw this principle about bicycles and countersteering over 100 years ago. And he said this, he says, I have asked dozens of bicycle riders how they turn to the left. I have never found a single person who stated all the facts correctly when first asked. They almost invariably say that to turn to the left, they turned the handlebar to the left and as a result made a turn to the left. But on further questioning them, some would agree that they first turned the handlebar a little to the right, and then as the machine inclined to the left, they turned the handlebar to the left and as a result made the circle inclining inward. So do you believe me now? Some of you are still not sure. That's okay. I think the principle of countersteering is firmly planted in your head, at least as a question now. And the next time you get on a bike, I guarantee you're going to want to find out for yourself if something so opposite of your beliefs might actually be the truth. And I hope you do. If you ever ride in traffic or in a bike lane next to parked cars, knowing how to countersteer could save your life. In a similar fashion, I hear Jesus' words in the same way. Something that sounds so opposite to everything I think now, so different than everything I think I see, that I find it hard to believe. But maybe, just maybe, in order to turn left, we have to first go right. We have to countersteer. We have to go against the flow. The way up is down. Maybe those who try to climb the ladder of success are headed towards disaster. And maybe Jesus is right, that the only way up is by first going down. Maybe we are supposed to descend into greatness. Just like Wilbur Wright could see that you had to go right in order to go left, Jesus could see that the way up was down. Now, we might think that Jesus just knew this truth because he was the Son of God and had this special connection to divine revelation. And maybe that's the case. But Jesus was actually picking up on something that had been announced over 700 years ago by the prophet Isaiah. Isaiah was foretelling a special time called the year of the Lord's favor. In Isaiah 61, it says, "The Spirit of the sovereign Lord is on me, because the Lord has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor." And so Jesus says, "Blessed are the poor." But Isaiah continues, "To proclaim the year of the Lord's favor and the day of vengeance of our God, to comfort all who mourn." Blessed are those who mourn, says Jesus. And Isaiah continues a bit further on. "Instead of your shame, you shall receive a double portion, and instead of disgrace, you will rejoice in your inheritance. And so you will inherit a double portion in your land, and everlasting joy will be yours. Blessed are the meek, says Jesus, for they will inherit the earth." It's the same theme that Jesus' ancestor, King David, picked up on in Psalm 37, where it says, "But the meek will inherit the land and enjoy peace and prosperity." And this year of the Lord's favor, this special time when God would bless the poor and those who mourn and the meek, Jesus declared that the time of the Lord's favor was actually about Him. It was all about Jesus. In Luke 4, we see a scene in which Jesus reads the Isaiah passage that talks about the poor and those who mourn and the meek. And when Jesus was done reading it, it says, "Then he rolled up the scroll, gave it back to the attendant, and sat down. The eyes of everyone in the synagogue were fastened on him. He began by saying to them, 'Today, this scripture is fulfilled in your hearing.'" In other words, Jesus is not giving advice. He's making an announcement. Being meek is not good advice, not in this world, but in God's kingdom, meekness is how things get done. And God's kingdom enters into this world when Jesus does. Jesus brings the kingdom. And in God's kingdom, you have to countersteer. The meek are blessed, not the mighty. Now, at this point, I have to apologize a little bit. We've been talking about the meek all this time, but we've never actually stopped to talk about what being meek actually means. Blessed are the meek. Who even talks like that anymore? Do any of you ever use that word? I mean, other than when quoting Jesus, did you ever use the word meek in the past week? In the past month? Past year? Ever? So what does it actually mean to be meek? In our English Bibles, the root word for meek is usually translated as gentle or humble. But being meek doesn't mean being passive or submissive. Being meek means having a gentle power, a quiet strength. For instance, the Apostle Paul wrote, "Brothers and sisters, if someone is caught in a sin, you who live by the Spirit should restore that person gently." That word gently is the same as meek. So being meek doesn't mean ignoring what is wrong or letting people push you around. Instead, meekness is gentle power. Jesus himself sets us as an example, showing us what it is to be meek. In Matthew 11, it says, "Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls." And later, when Jesus entered Jerusalem, it says, "See, your king comes to you, gentle and riding on a donkey, and on a colt, the foal of a donkey." Jesus was meek, but he was still king. Gentle power and quiet strength. When I was a child, my grandfather Mury was a powerful example of this to me. I was an obnoxious little kid with way too much energy and a taste for trouble. But somehow I could tell my grandpa meant business. Now, he died when I was only 8 years old, but I still remember when I was fighting with my brothers or my cousins, and he could just point and tell us to sit down on the couch, and we'd do it, no questions asked. He just had that kind of quiet authority. I had heard stories of his physical strength, and one day I challenged him and I said, "You're old now. You're not strong anymore." And I told you I was an obnoxious little kid. Well, my grandfather didn't react to me. Instead, he just asked me if I wanted to see for myself. And I said, Yes. And he gently grabbed onto my arm and said, okay, pull away. And I remember pulling and yanking and pushing my feet up against his knee to try and pull away, and I could not budge his iron grip. He had been a plumber all his life, and after all those years of turning wrenches and carrying cast iron tubs up flights of stairs with no elevators, it had made his grip like iron. I wept bitterly the day that he died. I don't think I've ever grieved for someone more deeply than that day. And when I think of what it means to be meek, I think of him. I think of him when I try to imagine the quiet strength and the gentle power of Jesus. The world will not honor people like that. But Jesus announced his kingdom, and his kingdom operates by different rules. In Jesus' kingdom, the meek will inherit the earth. Now, Jesus came to us with power. My grandfather had gained his physical strength through a lifetime of labor. Where can we gain the kind of strength that will allow us to be gentle and humble when we'd rather act out of anger and arrogance, like so many of the people we see in power around us? I believe that the strength to be meek, to be gentle and humble, comes from trusting in God's strength. We can stop trying to make things happen with our own power when we trust that God will use his power to make it happen. The meek don't take the earth by force. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. The promise is that the meek will inherit the earth. They don't take what belongs to them. Instead, God gives it to them as a birthright. Meekness is gentle because it rests on God's power. Meekness is humble because we don't make it happen. Instead, we trust in God's faithfulness that he will make it happen. And that's why we chose Mary as an example in the scripture that was read earlier. And Mary said, "My soul glorifies the Lord, and my spirit rejoices in God my Savior. For he has been mindful of the humble state of his servant. From now on, all generations will call me blessed. For the Mighty One has done great things for me. Holy is his name." He has been mindful of the humble state of his servant. Mary, a young girl, barely a teenager, had courage that her uncle Zechariah did not. Mary could trust God to do great things for her. Mary could trust the promises of God, just as she said in Luke 1, continuing on, "He has helped his servant Israel, remembering to be merciful to Abraham and his descendants forever, just as he promised our ancestors." Mary could be meek. She could be gentle and humble because her strength came from trusting in God's promises. Her strength came from God. Now, that didn't mean Mary was going to get into the best schools or rise to a position of leadership in the halls of power. But she would have a legacy that from then on, all generations would call her blessed. She trusted God. She trusted his promises. She trusted his word. And that gave her the strength to face public shame and endless questions about her character and virtue. The world would call her shameful, but we still call her blessed. God's kingdom was coming. It would come through her. God would be born into the world through Mary, a wonderful example of godly meekness. I have no doubt that the meekness of Jesus was a result of his divine character, but I also imagine that his meekness came from the gentle and humble example of his mother, Mary. Do you believe? Do you believe that the meek will inherit the earth? Not just in the distant future, but even now as God's kingdom works its way into this world? Or do you still hear Jesus' words as inspirational, but not transformational? Are Jesus' words a nice sentiment for the future when God sets everything right? Or are Jesus' words speaking a truth that we need to live by even now? Back in 2001, Jim Collins published a book, Good to Great. He and his team looked at 40 years of data on 13,000 publicly traded companies. Establishing objective criteria, they identified 1,435 companies that they deemed to be good. And amongst those 1,435 good companies, they distilled the list down to 11 great companies. Companies that outperformed the market and their competitors year after year after year. Well, Collins and his crew tried very hard to find the commonalities of those 11 companies, but in the end, the most striking universal was that each of those 11 companies had been led by a very specific kind of leader, a kind of leader who did not fit the traditional mold of leadership. Each one of these 11 leaders was marked by both fierce resolve and tremendous humility. They put the good of the company before themselves. They didn't seek credit, but they took responsibility. And every one of them had had a life-transforming experience that allowed them to see that it wasn't all about them. A number of them had had strong religious upbringings, several had had powerful conversion experiences, and more than a few had near-death experiences. But each of them had taken the opportunity to realize a deeper meaning to life than just getting ahead. Jim Collins and his team identified this kind of leader as a level 5 leader. In short, they were what the Bible might call meek. One such leader was Darwin E. Smith. Ever heard of him? He was one of the greatest business leaders of the 20th century, and most of you have never heard of him. Now, maybe you've heard of the company that he led through transformation, Kimberly-Clark. Some of you? Well, if you've ever used Huggies diapers or Kleenex tissues, you know Kimberly-Clark and Darwin E. Smith. Darwin Smith had a harrowing battle with throat cancer and was given a year to live. But he beat the odds and came away with a different understanding of life and success. And when he was appointed CEO of the company, it was supposed to be a temporary assignment. In fact, right after the meeting when he became CEO, one of the board members took him aside and said straight up that he didn't think that Darwin was the right person for the job. He was too quiet, too humble, too meek. But during his 20 years as CEO, Kimberly-Clark beat the general stock market by over 4 times, easily outperforming such companies as Hewlett-Packard and General Electric and Coca-Cola. And yet, he never got to the point where he thought that he had made it. Describing his time as CEO, he said, "I never stopped trying to become qualified for the job." But if the 11 greatest companies they could find were led by identifiably meek kinds of leaders, why don't we see more level 5 leaders? At first, Jim Collins used to think that the level 5 leaders were like rare birds, almost freaks of nature. But after he started pointing out the lack of such leaders while teaching his seminars, a surprising thing happened. Seminar after seminar, people would come up and give examples of level 5 leaders that they had observed or worked with. It turns out that many people have experienced level 5 leadership somewhere in their development. A level 5 sports coach, a level 5 platoon commander, a level 5 boss, a level 5 entrepreneur, a level 5 CEO. People began to clip articles and send emails with examples of people they think of as level 5 leaders, past or present. And faced with the flood of examples, Jim Collins came to a new conclusion. He said, "Then it dawned on me. Our problem is not a shortage of level 5 leaders, they exist all around us. Like the drawing of 2 faces that transforms itself into a vase, depending on how you look at the picture, level 5 leadership jumps out as soon as we change how we look at the world and alter our assumptions about how it best works." So why don't we see the meek inheriting the earth? Well, like Jim Collins said, maybe it's because we need to change how we look at the world and alter our assumptions about how it best works. Maybe we need to take Jesus seriously and alter our own perspective. Maybe we don't see the meek because we're looking at the celebrity leaders and we forget all of the examples of meek people, people of gentle strength and quiet humility. Celebrity leaders draw attention to themselves. That's what they do. But the meek go unnoticed precisely because they never draw attention to themselves. Right now, think of the people who have made a real difference in your life. Were they egocentric big shots? Or were they teachers and coaches and parents and managers and bosses who were servant leaders, putting the success of the team and you ahead of their own ego? And what about you? Do you have strength that comes from confidence in your own ability? Does your confidence come from your talent, your accomplishments, your attractiveness, your charm? Or does your confidence come from a deeper power and strength than your own? Does your confidence perhaps rest on knowing and trusting God's Word and His promises, like Mary, like Jesus? You may think you know the answer to those questions, but the real test comes when you are faced with fear, anxiety, or doubt. Let's say that someone close to you hurts you or fails you. Maybe your child is failing in school. Maybe they committed a crime or did something that publicly embarrasses you. Or maybe your spouse or a friend or a coworker betrays you. You discover that they've been lying to you or using you, or they intentionally try to cause you pain. Maybe your boss or your teacher is unreasonable and they abuse their power. How do you respond? With anger? Shouting? Yelling? Guilt and shame? All the signs of a wounded ego? Maybe a little revenge? Or do you respond with gentleness and quiet strength? Again, meekness doesn't mean that you just let things happen. Meekness doesn't mean being timid. In 2 Timothy it says, "For the Spirit God gave us does not make us timid, but gives us power, love, and self-discipline." Will you respond to pain with fear and anger, or will you be able to access the gentle power that comes from God's Spirit? Are you meek? Are you willing to be humble and gentle? Are you ready to reach out in love rather than anger or arrogance? Do you have the courage to do what is right rather than just be passive and ignore the problems around you? I want you to take a few moments as the worship team comes forward. Take a few moments and consider ways that God has treated you with gentleness and humility. Consider the ways that Jesus put your welfare ahead of His own. How He sacrificed His life so that you could live life to the full. He is God. He's the King. And yet He says, "Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls." And while you are considering the meekness of God, consider how God might be inviting you to do the same. Is there someone you need to forgive rather than continue to punish? Is there someone you need to confront rather than just give a pass? Is there someone you need to love for their own good rather than for what you receive? In the way that you lead others, is it time to start putting their success and future ahead of your own? I know it can be very tempting to think that anger and fear can make people change, or at least stop them from hurting us. But Jesus shows us a different way. His kingdom operates by different principles. Sometimes you need to countersteer, to work against the ways that seem so obviously right to you, and instead trust in Jesus when He says that you need to go right in order to go left. Take a few moments with those thoughts and bring them to God in prayer.